Now, close your eyes. No, really, go ahead. Picture this: you're not in your comfy bed, surrounded by soft pillows and the hum of modern life. Instead, you're standing on a vast, flat plain, the air shimmering with heat, and the sun, a relentless eye, beating down from a sky so wide it feels infinite. This isn't just any plain, it's a cradle, nestled between two great arteries of life, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. These aren't just bodies of water, they're the very lifeblood of what we call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, for eons. This place was a wild canvas, painted with the seasons, scorching summers, brief, intense winters, and the annual drama of the rivers. They'd swell with snow melt from distant mountains, sometimes gently nourishing the land, sometimes erupting in furious, unpredictable floods that would sweep away everything in their path. You'd have to be tough to live here, really tough. We're talking survive on a diet of mud and stubbornness tough. Imagine trying to plant crops when you never quite knew if your field would become a swamp or a desert in a matter of weeks. It's like playing a high-stakes game of agriculture or roulette, only with your entire family's survival on the line. But here's the kicker: despite the brutal unpredictability, these rivers also brought an incredible gift. When they receded, they left behind the rich, dark silt, a superfood for plants. This wasn't just dirt, it was liquid gold, teeming with nutrients, turning this otherwise harsh landscape into a patch of miraculous fertility. This promise of abundance, even with the constant threat of disaster, was like a siren's song, drawing nomadic hunter-gatherers to settle down, to plant their roots. Quite literally, in this challenging but rewarding soil, you can almost feel the urge to stay, can't you? The tantalizing scent of wild wheat, the rustle of reeds in the marshlands, promising fish and fowl. It was a place that demanded ingenuity. You couldn't just sit back and let nature do its thing. You had to work with it, fight against it, and sometimes just plain outsmart it. And outsmart it they did. Slowly, painstakingly, these early settlers began to understand the rhythm of the rivers. They learned to dig small channels to direct the water, to build earthen barriers to protect their precious crops. It was the very first step on a long road from scattered villages to sprawling cities. From simple survival to complex civilization, historians still debate whether the challenges or the bounty of Mesopotamia were the primary driver of its early innovations. Was it the desperation to control the floods that forced them to organize? Or was it the sheer potential for surplus that allowed for specialization and growth? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, really. But what's clear is that the rivers, both generous and cruel, were the ultimate sculptors of this ancient world. They weren't just geographical features, they were living entities, gods even, that dictated the very pulse of life. So, as you stand there, feeling the dry wind whip across your face, know that every blade of grass, every grain of sand, every drop of water tells a story. And that story, my friend, is just beginning. It's a story of human struggle, triumph, and the relentless pursuit of order in a chaotic world, all thanks to a couple of really opinionated rivers. You might say they were the original frenemies of civilization. Okay, so you've got a feel for the land, right? The push and pull of the rivers, the promise of fertile soil tempered by the threat of devastating floods. Now, fast forward a bit, maybe a few centuries. Those small settlements we talked about, the ones where people were just figuring out how to wrangle a bit of water for their crops, they're starting to get bigger, much bigger. And nowhere is this more evident than in a place called Uruk. Imagine Uruk around 3500 BCE. It's not just a village anymore, it's a sprawling urban center, a true marvel of the ancient world. When you first approach, you'd probably feel a mix of awe and a healthy dose of intimidation. The mud brick walls, perhaps already reaching impressive heights, would loom before you, hinting at the organized labor and immense power within. This wasn't just a collection of huts, it was a city, pulsating with life, noise, and a level of complexity you'd never dreamed possible. It's like going from your quaint little hometown to, well, ancient New York City, complete with its own version of traffic jams and endless construction. Inside Uruk, you wouldn't just see farmers anymore. Oh no, that's so last century. Here, you'd find specialists. People had jobs, and not just guy who plants barley or gal who milks goats. You'd see potters, their hands flying over the wheel, shaping clay into elegant vessels for storage and trade. You hear the rhythmic clanging of coppersmiths, pounding metal into tools and weapons. Weavers would be meticulously crafting intricate textiles, their looms clicking away like ancient metronomes. And everywhere, it seemed, there were builders. Uruk was a city constantly under construction, driven by an ambition that dwarfed anything that came before it. The central feature of Uruk, the undisputed superstar of its skyline, would be the Great Ziggurat. This wasn't just a temple, it was a mountain built by human hands. A massive stepped tower dedicated to the city's patron goddess, Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and fertility. You'd watch, mesmerized, as lines of laborers, their backs straining, haul baskets of mud bricks up ramps, each brick a testament to their devotion and collective will. This wasn't just about religious fervor, it was a demonstration of power, a way to unite a massive population under a common goal, proving that if enough people pushed in the same direction, they could literally move mountains, or at least build very tall ones. It's like a colossal, ancient version of a public works project, but with significantly more divine intervention and significantly fewer safety regulations. This level of organization, the sheer number of people working together on massive projects like the ziggurat and the extensive irrigation canals that fed the city, required something new. It required management. Someone had to decide who did what, who got how much barley, and who was in charge when a canal burst its banks. This led to the development of early forms of administration and a clear social hierarchy. At the top, the priests, believed to be intermediaries between the gods and humanity, held immense power. Beneath them, a burgeoning bureaucracy kept the city running like a well-oiled, or perhaps well-irrigated, machine. You'd notice the subtle but profound shift in daily life. People weren't just surviving, they were thriving, living in closer proximity, relying on each other in new ways. The surplus food generated by the efficient agriculture allowed some people to dedicate their time to crafts, to art, to governing. This specialization, this division of labor, was the engine that powered Uruk's growth. It was a revolutionary concept, the idea that not everyone had to be a farmer, that society could support other roles. Historians still debate whether the urban explosion was primarily driven by religious belief unifying the populace or by purely economic needs to manage resources. Either way, Uruk stood as a testament to human ingenuity, a place where civilization truly began to put on its big boy pants. It's a pretty odd detail, when you think about it, that the foundation of our modern, complex societies, with all our specialized jobs and endless bureaucracy, can be traced back to people trying to figure out how to get water from a river to a barley field without everyone starving. Talk about humble beginnings. You've seen the sheer scale of Uruk, the specialized labor, the towering ziggurat. But how did they manage all of this? How do you keep track of thousands of bushels of barley, hundreds of workers, and countless transactions without a system that would make your head spin? Well, my friend, this is where Uruk gives us one of humanity's greatest hits. Right up there with sliced bread and the internet. Writing. Imagine yourself in a bustling Urukian marketplace, perhaps near the temple granaries. You see sacks of grain being exchanged for pottery, livestock for textiles. How do you ensure everyone gets what they're owed, that no one cheats? and that the temple knows exactly how much wealth it possesses. Initially, they used simple tokens, little clay shapes representing sheep, jars of oil, or measures of grain. You'd put them in a sealed clay envelope, a bit like an ancient, edible receipt. But that was clunky. What if you needed to know what was inside without breaking the envelope? And what if you needed to record more complex information, like who delivered what, and when? This is where the magic happened. Instead of putting the tokens inside the envelope, they started pressing the tokens onto the outside of the clay envelope, leaving impressions. Then, someone had a brilliant, mind-blowing idea. Why press a token when you can just draw a picture of what the token represents? And then, why draw a picture when you can simplify it into a symbol? And just like that, you're witnessing the birth of cuneiform. You'd see scribes, not just in the temple, but in administrative offices, hunched over damp clay tablets. They weren't using pens and paper. Obviously, their tools were simple, a reed stylus, cut to a triangular point. They'd press the wedge-shaped end into the soft clay, creating distinctive marks. The word cuneiform itself comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. So, you're literally watching someone wedge write. It's a bit like trying to type on a keyboard made of Play-Doh, but somehow, they made it work at first. Cuneiform was purely practical. It was the original spreadsheet software, designed for accounting. You'd see records of barley harvests, lists of livestock, inventories of goods in the temple storehouses. If you were a temple administrator, you'd be thrilled. No more arguing with farmers about how many sheep they delivered. It was all right there, pressed into the clay. It was the ultimate "did you write that down?" moment in history. But then, something truly profound happened. The scribes realized they could use these wedge-shaped marks to represent not just objects, but sounds. This was the leap from pictograms, pictures representing objects, to phonetic symbols, symbols representing sounds. Suddenly, cuneiform could record not just lists, but names, verbs, and eventually, entire sentences. It became a flexible tool, capable of capturing the spoken word. Imagine the implications. Laws could be written down, ensuring consistency and fairness, at least in theory. Stories, myths, and religious hymns could be preserved for future generations. No longer relying solely on the fickle memory of oral tradition, knowledge could accumulate, building upon itself, rather than being lost with each passing generation. This was the beginning of recorded history itself. It's an odd detail, isn't it, that the very first widespread writing system was essentially developed by accountants. Talk about making history exciting. This invention fundamentally changed the nature of society. It allowed for more complex administration, larger states, and the transmission of culture and ideas across vast distances and through time. Historians still debate whether the invention of writing was a natural evolution driven by economic necessity or a sudden, brilliant leap of human intellect. Regardless, as you watch that scribe press his stylus into the clay, know that you are witnessing a canonical historical event. The moment humanity truly began to write its own story. It's like the ultimate Control plus S for civilization. All right, you've seen the mud-soaked plains, the bustling, growing city of Uruk, and the miraculous invention of cuneiform, which basically turned squishy clay into the world's first data storage device. But who was running this show? Who orchestrated the massive cigarette projects, managed the complex irrigation, and ensured that the barley was recorded and distributed fairly, or at least according to their rules? The answer, in early Mesopotamia, lay squarely with the priests and the powerful institutions they controlled, the temples. Imagine yourself walking through the grand courtyards of the Aina district in Uruk, the sacred precinct dedicated to the goddess Inanna. You'd be struck by the sheer scale, the meticulously laid out buildings, the constant activity. This wasn't just a place for worship, it was the beating heart of the city's economy and administration. The temples owned vast tracts of land, employed thousands of people, and controlled the redistribution of goods. They were like the ancient world's version of a combined government, bank, and major employer, all rolled into one. With a strong spiritual flavor, it was less separation of church and state and more church as the state. And also your landlord and employer. You'd see priests and priestesses, distinguished by their attire and bearing, moving with an air of authority. They were more than just spiritual leaders, they were the ultimate managers. They collected tithes, organized labor, oversaw granaries, and even settled disputes. They were seen as the direct intermediaries between humanity and the often fickle gods. If the rivers flooded or the crops failed, it was the priests who performed the elaborate rituals, offered the sacrifices, and interpreted the divine will. Your very survival, it seemed, depended on their good standing with the pantheon. The evolving social hierarchy was intricately linked to the temple's power. At the very top, of course, were the gods, with the local deity, like Inannu in Uruk, being the most prominent. Below them were the high priests and priestesses, followed by a growing class of scribes, administrators, and specialized artisans who worked directly for the temple. Then came the vast majority of the population, the farmers, laborers, and soldiers. It was a clear, top-down structure, with the temple acting as the central hub around which all life revolved. This was a significant departure from earlier, more egalitarian tribal societies. Now, your place in the pecking order was increasingly defined by your relationship to this powerful religious and economic institution. One of detail about Mesopotamian religious practices that might make you chuckle now. They believed that the gods needed to be fed. Literally, priests would prepare elaborate meals and place them before the cult statues in the temples, believing that the divine essences would consume the offerings. It's like a very high-stakes, spiritual room service. The leftovers, though, were then distributed among the priests and temple staff, so it wasn't a total waste, just a slightly unusual divine dining experience. As cities grew, so did the complexity of managing them. The temple-based system, while effective for a time, began to face new challenges. Inter-city rivalries emerged. Disputes over land and water escalated into armed conflicts. You can imagine the tension. Hey, that's our river water. No, it's our God's water. This required a new kind of leadership, one focused less on prayer and more on protection and conquest. While the priests remained powerful, a new figure began to rise, the Lugal, or great man, a secular leader who commanded armies and built walls, signifying a gradual shift in power from purely religious authority to a more militaristic one. Historians still debate whether this shift from temple state to more secular kingship was a gradual evolution or a series of distinct power grabs. But it's clear that the foundational role of the temples in centralizing authority, accumulating wealth, and organizing labor laid the groundwork for the more centralized states and empires that would follow. So, as you observe the bustling temple precincts of Uruk, remember that you're witnessing not just religious devotion, but the very genesis of complex governance, where the gods, quite literally, held the purse strings. So, you've seen the priests consolidating power, the city growing, and writing making its grand debut as the ultimate administrative tool. But what about the stories? What tales did the people of Mesopotamia tell around their flickering oil lamps after a long day of hauling mud bricks or negotiating barley deals? This brings us to perhaps the most famous narrative to emerge from this ancient land, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Imagine you're a tired Urukian laborer, resting after a particularly grueling shift on the cigarette. Someone begins to recite a tale, perhaps accompanied by a simple lyre. The story starts to unfold, carrying you away from the dusty streets and into a world of heroes, monsters, and gods. This wasn't just a bedtime story, It was a foundational myth, a shared narrative that helped people understand their world, their place in it, and the very nature of existence. It was, in essence, their version of the big blockbuster movie, the philosophical treatise, and the self-help book all rolled into one epic poem. The hero of this tale is Gilgamesh himself, the legendary king of Uruk. Now, he's not exactly Mr. Congeniality at the start. The epic describes him as a powerful, arrogant, and oppressive ruler who abuses his power and takes liberties with his subjects. He's basically the ancient world's spoiled rock star, doing whatever he wants, whenever he wants. The people of Uruk, exasperated, complain to the gods, begging for relief. You can almost hear them grumbling. Ugh, another one of Gilgamesh's late-night parties. Can't a guy get some sleep around here? In response, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man raised by animals, covered in hair, and possessing immense strength. He's the natural counterpoint to the civilized Gilgamesh, a force of nature sent to challenge the tyrannical king. Their initial encounter is a monumental wrestling match, a clash of titans that literally shakes the ground. It's the ultimate ancient cage match, folks. But instead of an eternal rivalry, something unexpected happens. They become the best of friends. A true romance for the ages. Their friendship transforms Gilgamesh. Together, they embark on heroic adventures, battling fearsome creatures like Humbarva, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest, and the bull of heaven, sent by an enraged goddess. These feats establish their legendary status, but also highlight themes of courage, loyalty, and the pursuit of glory. However, tragedy strikes. The gods, angered by their defiance, especially by their killing of the bull of heaven, which was sent by Inanna after Gilgamesh rejected her advances, she clearly did not take rejection well, decree that one of the friends must die. Enkidu, the wild man, falls ill and perishes. You can imagine the heartbreak. Gilgamesh is utterly devastated, confronted for the first time with the undeniable reality of mortality. This sudden loss plunges him into a profound existential crisis. He realizes that despite all his power and heroism, he, too, will die. This is the canonical historical event within this narrative. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself has a literary masterpiece and cultural touchstone, showcasing early human grappling with mortality. Driven by an overwhelming fear of death, Gilgamesh embarks on a desperate quest for immortality, seeking out Utnapishtim, the only mortal to have survived the Great Flood and been granted eternal life. This part of the epic contains a flood narrative strikingly similar to later biblical accounts, an odd detail that has fascinated scholars for centuries. He faces trials, journeys through darkness, and ultimately learns a hard truth: immortality is not for mortals. The wisest thing he can do, Utnapishtim advises, is to return to Uruk, embrace his mortality, and appreciate the life he has and the legacy he can build. So Gilgamesh returns, a changed man. He accepts his fate, dedicates himself to his city, and becomes a wise and just king, building Uruk's magnificent walls, which become his lasting monument. The epic ends not with Gilgamesh achieving eternal life, but with him finding wisdom and peace in the face of death, and understanding that true immortality lies in one's legacy and the collective memory of humanity. Historians still debate whether Gilgamesh was a real historical figure or purely a mythical one, but his story's enduring power is undeniable. It teaches lessons about friendship, heroism, loss, and the universal human struggle with mortality. It's a story that transcends time, and even if you never built a cigarette, you can probably relate to a good old existential crisis. You've seen Uruk flourish, witnessed the birth of writing, and wrestled with the existential angst of Gilgamesh. For a time, these city-states, like Uruk, Lagash, and Kish, thrived independently, occasionally squabbling over resources like a bunch of ancient siblings fighting over the last juice box. But around 2334 BCE, the Mesopotamian stage was about to get a new kind of star, one who wasn't content with just ruling a city. He wanted to rule everything. Enter Sargon of Akkad. Imagine yourself now, no longer a quiet observer in Uruk, but perhaps a soldier in a smaller city-state, nervously looking north. Whispers are spreading like wildfire, tales of a charismatic leader from a place called Akkad. Sargon's origins are shrouded in legend, making him sound almost like a superhero origin story. The Sargon birth legend, an odd detail, claims he was secretly born to a high priestess, set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates River. Sound familiar? And found by a humble gardener. He rose from obscurity, not through divine right or priestly lineage, but through sheer military genius and a ruthless determination. He was the ultimate self-made man. If self-made involves a lot of sharp bronze and tactical brilliance, Sargon wasn't content with the traditional model of city-state power. He envisioned something grander, something unified. He systematically began to conquer the various Sumerian city-states, one by one, until he had forged an empire, the first of its kind, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. This was a canonical historical event. Truly, this wasn't just a collection of alliances. It was a centralized state, controlled by a single ruler with a powerful, professional army. You can almost hear the distinct, rhythmic beat of his marching legions, a sound that would have sent shivers down the spine of any independent city king. Think about the sheer audacity of this. For centuries, the idea was that each city had its own god, its own king, its own destiny. Sargon basically said, "Nah, we are doing things differently now. My destiny is everyone's destiny." He crushed rebellions with brutal efficiency, leaving no doubt who was in charge. He appointed his own loyal governors to oversee conquered territories, often replacing local rulers with his own trusted men. It was a top-down management style that would make any modern CEO green with envy, albeit with significantly more impalements. Under Sargon, the Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue, began to spread, slowly supplanting Sumerian as the dominant language of administration and culture across his vast empire. He standardized weights and measures, making trade easier and more efficient across his vast domains. Imagine trying to trade grain with someone whose bushel is entirely different from yours. Sargon basically said, "Enough of this nonsense. We're all using my bushel now." This facilitated economic integration and helped knit his diverse empire together. Sargon's dynasty, known as the Sargonic dynasty, lasted for over a century, passing power down through his sons and grandsons. They continued his policies, solidifying the empire's control and expanding its reach. But from this period shows a distinct shift, becoming more realistic and monumental, often glorifying the king and his military prowess. You'd see massive sculptures depicting Sargon with his characteristic long beard, a symbol of his power and authority. Historians still debate whether Sargon's empire was a truly cohesive entity or merely a collection of subjugated city-states held together by brute force. Was it a genuine step towards a unified nation-state, or just a temporary imposition of one man's will? Regardless, the Akkadian Empire profoundly impacted the political landscape of Mesopotamia. It proved that large-scale empires were possible, and it set a precedent for future rulers who would seek to emulate Sargon's ambition and success. He was, without a doubt, a game-changer, transforming the Mesopotamian chessboard into a much larger playing field. You might say he put the Mego in Mesopotamia. So, Sargon built the world's first empire, a truly monumental achievement that stretched from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea. You probably thought, okay, this is it, permanent empire time. But if history teaches us anything, especially Mesopotamian history, it's that permanence is often just a really long coffee break. And so, the mighty Akkadian Empire, for all its revolutionary grandeur, eventually faced the inevitable, the Akkad collapse. Imagine the empire, vast and sprawling, held together by Sargon's iron will and the efficiency of his successors. But even iron can rust, and efficiency can be strained. After about a century, the cracks began to show. There wasn't a single, dramatic explosion. It was more like a slow, agonizing unraveling. You can picture it, a distant murmur of discontent, then outright rebellion in a far-flung province, requiring the central army to march hundreds of miles, only for another rebellion to flare up back home. It was like trying to put out 5 fires at once when you only have 2 buckets of water. The causes of the collapse were complex, a tangled knot of factors that historians still passionately debate. Was it internal strife, with ambitious governors trying to break away? Was it a series of weak rulers after the initial strong line of Sargon's descendants? Or was it something else entirely, something beyond human control? One prominent theory, and a truly odd detail, is the idea of a catastrophic climate change. Some archaeological evidence, including changes in settlement patterns and studies of ancient dust layers, suggests a sudden, severe drought, lasting perhaps a century or more, struck Mesopotamia around 2200 BCE. Imagine your carefully constructed irrigation system, your massive granaries, all rendered useless as the lifeblood rivers dwindled to trickles and the fertile plains turned to dust. It's like your entire economy suddenly decided to go on a very long, very dry vacation. This environmental disaster would have been catastrophic. Food production would plummet, leading to widespread famine and mass migrations. People would become desperate, abandoning their cities in search of water and sustenance. This instability would have naturally weakened the central authority of Akkad. If the king couldn't even guarantee food for his people, what good was his empire? And then, into this already chaotic situation, came the Gshans. These were a people from the Zagros Mountains to the east, described by Mesopotamian texts as a barbarous horde, people who know no kings, and locusts of the mountains. They weren't sophisticated empire builders, they were raiders, opportunists who swooped down on the weakened cities, plundering and laying waste. You can imagine the terror their arrival would have inspired. The desperate pleased to the gods as their livelihoods crumbled. Their presence marked a period of relative anarchy and decentralization in Mesopotamia, often referred to as the Dark Age. It's like the world's first empire just hit the reset button, but not in a fun, digital way. The fall of Akkad was a canonical historical event that sent shock waves through Mesopotamia. It demonstrated the fragility of even the most powerful states and the immense power of environmental factors. For about a century, Mesopotamia splintered back into smaller, independent city-states. Much like it had been before Sargon, the grand idea of a unified empire seemed to vanish, replaced by regional squabbles and a general sense of uncertainty. Historians still debate whether the Gshan invasions were the primary cause of the collapse or merely the final nail in the coffin of an empire already crumbling from internal and environmental pressures. It's hard to say definitively, much like trying to figure out if your ancient tablet broke because you dropped it or because it was already cracked. But regardless of the precise cause, the period following the Akkad collapse was one of disarray, a chaotic interlude before the next great power would rise to re-establish order, showing that even in ancient times, what goes up must eventually get sacked by mountain barbarians. So, the Akkadian Empire, the world's first, crumbled into dust, leaving behind a power vacuum and a period of instability often dominated by the barbarian Gshans. It felt like Mesopotamia had taken a giant step backward, right? All that centralized control, all that grand ambition, seemingly undone. But here's the thing about Mesopotamia, it always found a way to rebound, to reinvent itself. And that brings us to the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance and the rise of the third dynasty of Ur. Imagine the chaos beginning to subside. The Gshans, for all their destructive power, weren't great administrators. Their rule was patchy and decentralized. Slowly, patiently, the surviving Sumerian city-states began to reassert themselves. Like a grand old tree, trimmed back by a harsh winter, Sumerian culture began to sprout new leaves. And from this re-emerging landscape, around 2112 BCE, the city of Ur rose to unparalleled prominence. It had been a significant city before, a rival Uruk in its heyday, but under its new dynasty, founded by King Ur-Nema, it would achieve a level of centralized control and cultural revival that would make Sargon himself proud. This was a canonical historical event, a resurgence that brought back the glory of Sumerian civilization. Ur became the undisputed capital of a new, highly centralized empire, sometimes called the Ur-3 Empire. You'd be absolutely blown away by Ur at its peak. It was a bustling metropolis, perhaps even grander and more meticulously planned than Uruk had been. The Ziggurat of Ur, still a magnificent ruin today, was built during this period, dedicated to the moon god Nana, also known as Sin. Imagine this colossal structure, rising in steps towards the heavens, its terraced gardens and shrines visible from miles away. It wasn't just a religious monument, it was a symbol of the king's piety, his power, and the incredible organizational capabilities of his state. You'd see thousands of laborers, meticulously placing bricks, much like in Uruk, but now under an even more rigid, centralized command. It's like they had an ancient project manager with a very strict deadline and no concept of coffee breaks. The kings of Ur-3 were meticulous administrators. They established a sophisticated bureaucracy, probably inspired by Sargon's earlier attempts, but far more refined. Every aspect of the economy was tightly controlled, from vast agricultural estates producing enormous surpluses of grain and livestock, to the management of immense numbers of temple slaves. You'd find scribes everywhere, diligently recording everything on clay tablets, tax receipts, rations issued, court judgments, even the smallest transactions. It was a bureaucratic paradise, or nightmare, depending on your perspective. This meticulous record-keeping is an odd detail that has given modern historians an unparalleled window into the daily life and economy of this period. Imagine the archaeologists' joy when they unearth a tablet detailing the purchase of 5 goats and 3 bushels of barley from 4,000 years ago. The Ur-3 kings also issued comprehensive legal codes, the most famous of which is the Code of Ur-Nema, predating Hammurabi's more famous code by several centuries. While less extensive, it laid out laws regarding offenses like assault, false testimony, and even divorce, prescribing specific penalties. It showed a clear commitment to establishing justice and order throughout the empire. It was less an eye for an eye and more a fine for a black eye, a bit more progressive in its punishments than later codes. Under Ur-3, trade flourished. Merchant ships sailed up and down the Persian Gulf, bringing exotic goods from distant lands, copper from Magan, Oman, timber from Dilmun, Bahrain, and precious stones like lapis lazuli from as far away as Afghanistan. Ur was a hub of international commerce, connecting Mesopotamia to a wider world. You can almost smell the spices, hear the chatter of foreign tongues, and feel the vibrant energy of its bustling harbor. Historians still debate whether the Ur-3 Empire represented a true restoration of Sumerian cultural identity or if it was simply a new political entity that adopted Sumerian forms for legitimacy. Regardless, its period of dominance was a golden age for Sumerian culture, a testament to its resilience and adaptive capacity. For about a century, the Ur-3 Empire brought peace, prosperity, and an unprecedented level of centralization to Mesopotamia, showing that even after a collapse, you can always build yourself back up, often bigger and with more bureaucracy. So, the glory days of Ur-3, with its meticulously managed empire and towering ziggurats, eventually faded, much like all the Mesopotamian empires before it. The familiar pattern of internal strife, economic decline, and external pressures, this time from Amorite and Elamite invaders, brought about its collapse around 2000 BCE. The region fragmented once more into a patchwork of independent city-states, each vying for supremacy. It's like the ancient world's version of a perpetual reboot, isn't it? But don't worry, a new star is about to rise. And with it, a legal system that would echo through millennia. We're talking about Babylon, and its most famous king, Hammurabi. Imagine yourself around 1750 BCE. The city-state of Babylon, once a minor player, is now growing in power and influence under a shrewd and ambitious king named Hammurabi. He wasn't a flash-in-the-pan conqueror like some of his predecessors. Hammurabi was a master strategist, both on the battlefield and in the council chambers. He spent the first few decades of his reign consolidating power, building alliances, and patiently waiting for the opportune moment to strike. He was the ultimate chess player, watching all the pieces on the Mesopotamian board. Then, when the time was right, he launched a series of brilliant military campaigns, systematically defeating his rivals, Larsa, Mari, Eshnauna, and finally the powerful kingdom of Assyria to the north. Through a combination of cunning diplomacy and decisive military victories, Hammurabi forged a vast empire that encompassed much of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf in the south to significant portions of Assyria in the north. This was a canonical historical event, the establishment of the old Babylonian Empire under a single, formidable ruler. You can almost hear the triumphant shouts of his soldiers as they marched into newly conquered cities, bearing the standard of Marduk, Babylon's patron god. But Hammurabi's legacy isn't just about military might. In fact, what he's most remembered for, what truly cemented his place in history, is his comprehensive legal code, the Code of Hammurabi. Imagine a massive black stone stele, over 2 meters tall, standing proudly in a public place, carved into its surface, in meticulous cuneiform script, are 282 laws, covering virtually every aspect of ancient Babylonian life. At the top of the stele, you'd see a relief carving of Hammurabi himself, standing respectfully before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, receiving the laws directly from the deity. It's a powerful image, conveying divine authority and the king's role as the enforcer of cosmic order. This wasn't just a collection of rules, it was a sophisticated attempt to establish a uniform system of justice across an entire empire. No more localized squabbles or arbitrary rulings by local straw men. Hammurabi's code was meant to be universal. It covered everything from family law, marriage, divorce, inheritance, to property law, land, slaves, debts, commercial regulations, contracts, trade disputes, and penalties for various crimes, theft, assault, murder. It even had laws for specific professions, like builders and doctors. An odd detail: if a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder was put to death. If it killed the owner's son, the builder's son was put to death. Talk about a strong incentive for quality craftsmanship. You really wouldn't want to be a slacker on a Hammurabi construction site. The Code of Hammurabi is famously known for its lex talionis, or law of retaliation, often summarized as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If a man destroyed the eye of another man, his eye would be destroyed. However, the application of this principle often depended on social status. If a higher-ranking person injured a commoner, the penalty might be a fine rather than physical retaliation. This nuance means it wasn't always strictly reciprocal, but it was a revolutionary step towards codified justice. Historians still debate whether the Code of Hammurabi was a set of actual laws regularly enforced or more of a legal treatise, a statement of ideal justice and a declaration of Hammurabi's wisdom. Regardless, it served as a powerful model for future legal systems, influencing later codes in the Near East and beyond. It was a tangible expression of what it meant to live in an organized society, reminding everyone that while the gods were still in charge, the king had some pretty strict rules too. So, Hammurabi wasn't just a conqueror, he was a lawgiver, laying down the foundation for justice that would reverberate through history. Under his reign and for a time after him, Babylon wasn't just a military powerhouse, it became a dazzling center of intellectual and cultural life. Imagine yourself in Babylon during its golden age, not just a city, but a beacon of knowledge that rivaled anything the ancient world had to offer. Picture the bustling streets, not just with merchants and soldiers, but with scholars, scribes, and artisans. The air would hum with intellectual curiosity. Babylon, perhaps more than any other Mesopotamian city, embraced the pursuit of knowledge. It became a hub for astronomy, mathematics, and sophisticated scribal arts. You'd find towering observatories, not for looking through telescopes, of course, but for meticulously charting the movements of the stars and planets. The Babylonians believed that the celestial bodies held clues to the will of the gods and the future of humanity. They weren't just stargazing for fun, they were divining destiny. Their astronomical observations were incredibly precise for their time. They developed sophisticated calendars, accurately predicted lunar and solar eclipses, and even identified the movements of the 5 visible planets. This wasn't just random guesswork, it was systematic, long-term data collection, recorded on thousands of cuneiform tablets. An odd detail, they divided the day into 24 hours, each hour into 60 minutes, and each minute into 60 seconds, a system we still use today. So, every time you check your watch, you're giving a little nod to ancient Babylonian astronomers. You could almost say they were the original Time Lords. Their achievements in mathematics were equally astounding. The Babylonians used a base 60 numeral system, which is why we have 360 degrees in a circle and 60 minutes in an hour. They developed advanced algebraic methods, understood geometry, and could solve complex equations that would stump most of us without a calculator. Imagine a Babylonian school, scribes diligently working on clay tablets, solving quadratic equations or calculating the area of irregular shapes. It's like ancient algebra class, only stickier. They even had tables for multiplication, division, squares, and square roots, showing an impressive grasp of numerical relationships. The scribal tradition in Babylon was highly esteemed, copying ancient texts, preserving knowledge, and creating new works were considered noble professions. Libraries in Babylon, like the one associated with the Assyria temple, housed tens of thousands of clay tablets, covering every conceivable subject. Epic poems like Gilgamesh, hymns, myths, medical treatises, legal precedents, omens, astronomical observations, and even dictionaries. You could lose yourself for years just sifting through the accumulated wisdom of centuries. This preservation of knowledge is a canonical historical event in itself, ensuring that the intellectual achievements of Mesopotamia were not lost to time. Babylonian art also flourished, characterized by detailed relief carvings, intricate cylinder seals, and monumental architecture. Imagine the vibrant glazed brick reliefs adorning the Ishtar Gate, depicting fierce lions, mythical dragons, and powerful borals, rendered in brilliant blues, yellows, and whites. These weren't just decorations, they were symbols of the city's power, its divine protection, and its artistic sophistication. But even with all this intellectual and cultural brilliance, the Babylonian Empire, like its predecessors, faced internal and external pressures. The later part of the Old Babylonian period saw a weakening of central authority and a series of invasions. The Hittites, an Anatolian people, sacked Babylon around 1595 BCE, a devastating blow that marked the end of the Hammurabi dynasty. Mesopotamia once again plunged into a period of fragmentation and foreign domination. Historians still debate whether Babylon's intellectual advancements were primarily driven by practical needs, like accounting and surveying, or by a genuine philosophical curiosity about the universe. It's probably a bit of both, a beautiful synergy between the practical and the profound. But whatever the motivation, the legacy of Babylonian scholarship, particularly in astronomy and mathematics, would influence later Greek, Indian, and Islamic traditions, proving that even as empires fall, knowledge can continue its slow, quiet march through history. All right, to Old Babylon, for all its intellectual splendor and Hammurabi's legendary laws, eventually suffered the fate of all Mesopotamian empires. It crumbled. The Hittites swooped in, sacked the city, and then, rather inconveniently, just left, leaving a power vacuum and a chaotic patchwork of small estates. For several centuries, Mesopotamia remained fractured, a land ripe for a new power to assert itself, and assert itself it did, with an iron fist, a terrifying roar, and an unparalleled military machine. Get ready for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Imagine yourself around 900 BCE, perhaps a farmer living in a small, unwalled village somewhere in northern Mesopotamia. You'd live in constant dread of the north, for that's where the Assyrians were brewing. From their heartland along the upper Tigris River, cities like Ashur and later Nineveh, they began to expand. Unlike previous empires that often tried to assimilate or cooperate with conquered peoples, the Assyrians had a different approach. Absolute, terrifying domination. They were the ancient world's bogeyman, and their arrival was usually preceded by widespread panic. The Assyrians honed their military to an unprecedented level of efficiency and brutality. They were masters of siege warfare, employing massive battering rams, movable siege towers, and sappers who would tunnel under enemy walls. Their army was highly organized, disciplined, and equipped with advanced iron weaponry, giving them a significant advantage over opponents still relying on bronze. You can almost hear the rhythmic thump of their drums, the blare of their trumpets, and the terrifying war cries as their chariots thundered across the plains. It was a sound that would make your blood run cold. This development of the professional, highly effective Assyrian war machine is a canonical historical event, changing the face of warfare forever. Their tactics were also designed to instill fear. They routinely engaged in mass deportations, forcibly relocating conquered populations across their vast empire. This served multiple purposes: breaking the will of rebellious peoples, integrating new populations into the Assyrian workforce, and preventing future uprisings by scattering ethnic groups. An odd detail, perhaps, but it was a calculated strategy that showed a chilling understanding of social control. Imagine being uprooted from your ancestral home and marched hundreds of miles to a new land, speaking a foreign tongue, under constant supervision. Talk about a forced relocation program. The Assyrian kings, like Ashurnapal II, Shalmaneser III, and the mighty Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, were ruthless and ambitious. They boasted of their conquests in detailed and often graphic relief carvings on the walls of their palaces. You'd see scenes of Assyrian soldiers impaling prisoners, beheading enemies, and leading long lines of captives. These weren't just historical records, they were powerful propaganda, designed to intimidate potential rebels and glorify the king's power and the might of the god Ashur. It was their version of a highly stylized, R-rated documentary, played on repeat for anyone who dared to visit the palace. Their empire, at its peak, was truly enormous, stretching from Egypt in the west, through the entire Fertile Crescent, and deep into the Zagros Mountains to the east. Governing such a vast and diverse territory required an extensive network of roads, relay stations for messengers, and a sophisticated administrative system. They developed a provincial system, with governors loyal to the king, ensuring the tribute flowed back to the imperial core. However, This constant warfare and brutal subjugation also bred deep resentment. The Assyrians were constantly battling rebellions across their empire, from the Babylonians in the south to the kingdoms of the Levant. It was a vicious cycle: conquer, suppress rebellion, conquer again. Historians still debate whether the Assyrian reliance on terror and military force was a sustainable model for empire building, or if it ultimately led to their downfall by creating too many enemies. One thing is certain: they pushed the boundaries of imperial power, demonstrating how far a centralized, militaristic state could expand through sheer, unadulterated force. They were like the ancient world's version of that really aggressive neighbor who mows his lawn at 6 a.m. and glares at everyone. You've just witnessed the terrifying efficiency of the Assyrian war machine. A relentless force that carved out an empire through sheer military might and a generous application of fear. But here's the interesting paradox: despite their reputation for brutality, the Assyrians were also incredibly sophisticated, particularly when it came to the pursuit and preservation of knowledge. Forget the battle axes for a moment. Let's talk about books. Or rather, clay tablets. Imagine you're in Nineveh, the last great capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, during the reign of King Ashurbanipal, ruled 668 to 627 BCE, while his armies were out crushing rebellions and conquering new territories. Ashurbanipal himself was obsessed with knowledge. He was not just a warrior king, he was a scholar king, fluent in Cuneiform, and passionately dedicated to collecting and preserving the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamia. This dedication led to the creation of the Library of Ashurbanipal, a canonical historical event in the history of libraries and knowledge preservation. Picture vast halls lined with neatly arranged clay tablets, tens of thousands of them, carefully catalogued and organized. This wasn't just a random collection, it was a systematic effort to gather every known text from across Mesopotamia. Ashurbanipal sent his scribes throughout his empire, ordering them to copy and collect every important tablet they could find. Whether it was an ancient Sumerian epic, a Babylonian astronomical treatise, a medical text, a list of omens, or even a dictionary, he understood that knowledge was power, and that preserving the past was crucial for the future. It's like he had the ancient world's most ambitious download everything project going on. The content of this library was incredibly diverse. You'd find multiple copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, alongside historical annals detailing Assyrian conquests, definitely written from their perspective, prophecies, prayers, and administrative records. There were also numerous scholarly works, mathematical tables, astronomical observations. Remember those Babylonians and their base 60 system? The Assyrians loved their data, medical diagnoses and cures, some surprisingly effective, others not so much, and even grammatical texts for learning ancient Sumerian, which by then was largely a scholarly language, much like Latin is today. One of detail about this library: many of the tablets were marked as belonging to the king, with curses inscribed on them against anyone who dared to remove or deface them. For example, a common inscription might read, "He who removes this tablet or defaces it, may the god Ashur tear out his foundations and wipe out his offspring." Talk about a strict borrowing policy. You wouldn't want to forget to return your library books here. The scribes in Ashurbanipal's library weren't just copyists, they were scholars in their own right, editing, collating, and commenting on the texts. They developed a sophisticated system for cataloging the tablets, often by subject matter and title. This library wasn't just a dusty archive, it was a living center of intellectual activity, where scholars studied, debated, and continued the long intellectual traditions of Mesopotamia. This systematic preservation was crucial because, as we'll soon see, the Assyrian Empire was not long for this world. When Nineveh eventually fell, the library, though damaged, was buried under the debris of the city. This burial actually helped to preserve many of the clay tablets, firing them hard and protecting them from the elements, allowing archaeologists to uncover them millennia later. It's a remarkable stroke of historical luck. Historians still debate whether Ashurbanipal's motivation for building this library was purely for scholarly pursuit or if it was also a strategic tool to assert his intellectual dominance over conquered peoples and reinforce his image as a wise and powerful ruler. Perhaps it was a combination of both. What is undeniable is that his library stands as a monumental achievement, a testament to the Mesopotamian reverence for written knowledge. It was a true intellectual treasure trove, and thanks to Ashurbanipal's foresight, we can still read many of those stories and learn from those observations today, centuries after his mighty empire turned to dust. So, you've admired the scholarly pursuits of Ashurbanipal, a king who, despite commanding a terrifying war machine, also nurtured one of the ancient world's greatest libraries. You might think such a powerful, organized, and intellectually advanced empire would last forever. But as you've learned, permanence in Mesopotamia is about as reliable as a weather forecast from an ancient oracle with a really bad cold. The very brutality that built the Neo-Assyrian Empire also sowed the seeds of its destruction. This brings us to the dramatic and utterly devastating fall of Nineveh. Imagine the vast Assyrian Empire in the late 7th century BCE. It's stretched thin, constantly fighting rebellions in every corner. The sheer cost in manpower and resources to maintain such a huge military, to keep so many diverse and resentful peoples subjugated, was enormous. The constant cycle of conquest and brutal suppression, while effective in the short term, created a seething cauldron of hatred among its neighbors and conquered subjects. Everyone had a bone to pick with Assyria. They were the ultimate schoolyard bullies. And eventually, everyone gets tired of the bullying. The final act began around 627 BCE, shortly after the death of Ashurbanipal, who had managed to hold the empire together through sheer force of will and intellect. His successors were not as capable, and internal power struggles began to weaken the core. This was the opening that the oppressed peoples had been waiting for. From the south, in ancient Babylonia, rose a powerful Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar. He allied himself with the Medes, a formidable power from the east, led by King Cyaxares. These two forces, along with other disgruntled groups like the Scythians and Cimmerians, formed a grand coalition, a united front against their common oppressor. This alliance, forged out of shared hatred for Assyrian dominance, was a canonical historical event that marked the beginning of the end for the mighty empire. You can almost hear the roar of triumph from these combined armies as they finally turned the tables. The coalition launched a series of devastating attacks, chipping away at Assyrian strongholds. In 614 BCE, they sacked Asha, one of Assyria's ancient capitals, a symbolic blow that signaled the empire's vulnerability. But the ultimate target, the jewel in the Assyrian crown, was Nineveh, the magnificent capital that Ashurbanipal had adorned with his grand palaces and library. Imagine the siege of Nineveh, which began around 612 BCE. The city was heavily fortified, surrounded by massive walls, a formidable challenge for any attacking army. But the combined forces of the Babylonians and Medes were relentless. They diverted rivers, built siege ramps, and assaulted the city from all sides. The fighting would have been ferocious, a desperate last stand for the Assyrians. One odd detail from accounts of the siege, possibly legend but indicative of the chaos, is that a great flood from the Tigris River supposedly undermined a portion of Nineveh's walls, aiding the attackers. Whether divine intervention or simply bad luck, the walls eventually breached. The fall of Nineveh was utterly devastating. The city was thoroughly plundered, burned, and largely destroyed. The magnificent palaces, once adorned with reliefs depicting Assyrian triumphs, were reduced to rubble. The vast libraries, while buried and thus partially preserved, ceased to be active centers of scholarship. The Assyrian people, who had terrorized so many for so long, were themselves subjected to the wrath of their former victims. It was a complete and catastrophic collapse, leaving little but ruins where a glorious empire once stood. It was like watching a giant, ancient skyscraper just crumble to dust. Historians still debate the precise tactical details of the siege and the exact role of each allied group. But the outcome was undeniable. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was wiped off the map. Its former territories were divided between the triumphant Babylonians and Medes. The rapid and brutal fall of such a powerful empire served as a cautionary tale for future rulers, demonstrating that even the most formidable military might could not guarantee eternal dominance, especially when it was built on a foundation of terror and resentment. The long reign of the great Assyrian bully had finally come to an end. You've just witnessed the spectacular, brutal collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, its capital Nineveh reduced to ashes. It was a decisive end for a terrifying superpower. But, as we've seen countless times in this land between the rivers, a power vacuum never lasts long, and from the ashes of Assyria, the ancient city of Babylon rose again, experiencing a final, breathtaking golden age under the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and its most famous king, Nebuchadnezzar II. Imagine the exhilaration in Babylon after the fall of Nineveh. They were no longer under the heel of their Assyrian overlords. They were the liberators, the victors. Nabopolassar, the Chaldean king who forged the alliance against Assyria, laid the groundwork for this new empire. But it was his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who would elevate Babylon to unprecedented heights of glory and splendor. He reigned from 605 to 562 BCE, a period of immense construction and renewed imperial power. This was a canonical historical event, a final, magnificent flourish of independent Mesopotamian rule. Nebuchadnezzar was a relentless military campaigner, securing the vast territories once held by the Assyrians and expanding Babylonian influence. He famously conquered the kingdom of Judah, destroying Jerusalem and deporting its elite to Babylon, an event etched deeply into biblical history. You can almost feel the fear of those conquered peoples, but also the immense pride of the Babylonians as their empire stretched far and wide. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just a conqueror, he was an obsessive builder. He transformed Babylon into perhaps the most magnificent city of the ancient world. Imagine approaching the city, and your jaw would drop. The massive defensive walls, perhaps the largest and thickest ever built in antiquity, would dwarf you. The famous Ishtar Gate, adorned with vibrant glazed bricks depicting magnificent lions, bulls, and dragons in brilliant blues and yellows, would be a sight to behold. It was less a gate and more a grand, colorful declaration of power. You'd probably think, wow, they really went all out on the entrance, didn't they? Beyond the gate, the city was a masterpiece of urban planning. Wide processional ways, temples dedicated to various gods, administrative buildings, and bustling marketplaces filled the city. But the true wonders, the ones that have captivated imaginations for millennia, were the monumental structures built by Nebuchadnezzar himself. First, there was the Etemenanki, the colossal ziggurat dedicated to the god Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon. While the original Tower of Babel's story might be an exaggeration, this ziggurat was truly enormous, believed to have 7 tiers and reaching a height of over 90 meters, around 300 feet. You would feel incredibly small standing at its base, gazing up at its immense scale, a veritable ladder to the heavens. It was a tangible link between the earthly city and the divine realm, a massive architectural prayer. Then there were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Whether they truly existed as a massive, tiered garden complex built by Nebuchadnezzar for his homesick Median wife, or if they were a later Greek fabrication or perhaps confused with another terraced garden, is an odd detail and still debated by historians. But imagine the possibility: lush green terraces rising majestically from the flat plain, watered by an ingenious system of pumps, a verdant oasis in the dusty city. It would have been a miracle of engineering and a breathtaking display of royal wealth and power. Picture yourself strolling through exotic plants, the scent of blossoms heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the surrounding desert heat. It would be the ultimate ancient escape room, but with way more flora. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a vibrant center of culture, trade, and learning. The scribal schools continued to flourish, building on the astronomical and mathematical knowledge of earlier Babylonian periods. The city was a melting pot of different peoples, brought together by trade and imperial decree. However, even this new golden age was not destined to last. After Nebuchadnezzar's long and glorious reign, a series of weaker rulers followed, and internal dissension began to plague the empire. The rising power of Persia, under its formidable leader Cyrus the Great, loomed large on the horizon. Historians still debate whether Nebuchadnezzar's aggressive building projects and constant warfare ultimately weakened the empire's long-term stability, or if the internal squabbles after his death were the primary cause of its downfall. Regardless, the Neo-Babylonian Empire represented the last truly independent Mesopotamian superpower, a final, brilliant chapter before a new chapter began. So, Nebuchadnezzar II built a Babylon that truly lived up to its legendary status, a city of towering ziggurats and perhaps even hanging gardens, a final, dazzling display of independent Mesopotamian power. But as you've learned on this long journey through the land between the rivers, even the grandest empires eventually meet their fate. The curtain was about to fall on independent Mesopotamian rule, giving way to an even larger, more encompassing power, the Persian Empire, and its visionary founder, Cyrus the Great. Imagine the year 539 BCE. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, though still formidable, was facing internal dissent and a series of less effective rulers after Nebuchadnezzar. Meanwhile, a new force had emerged from the east, a rapidly expanding empire forged by the brilliant leadership of Cyrus the Great of Persia. Cyrus wasn't just a conqueror, he was a master of diplomacy and a remarkably enlightened ruler for his time. He was, in a way, the anti-Assyrian, often preferring persuasion and integration over brutal subjugation. Cyrus set his sights on Babylon. The city, despite its massive walls, was internally divided. The last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, was unpopular with the priests of Marduk, having favored the moon god Sin and spent much of his time away from the capital. This disaffection, an odd detail, meant that when Cyrus's armies approached, there was little internal unity to resist them. The fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Great was a canonical historical event, a pivotal moment that marked the end of indigenous Mesopotamian rule and the beginning of a new era. What's truly remarkable is that it wasn't a bloody siege like the fall of Nineveh. According to historical accounts, Cyrus's army diverted the Euphrates River, which flowed under Babylon's walls, allowing his troops to march into the city through the dried-up riverbed. They entered almost unopposed. Imagine the stunned silence as the Persian forces, led by Cyrus's general Gobryas, marched into the heart of the great city. No burning, no widespread plunder, at least initially, no mass slaughter. Cyrus presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, restoring the rights of the people and the veneration of their gods, particularly Marduk. The famous Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscribed with a declaration of his policies, paints him as a benevolent ruler, chosen by Marduk himself to restore order and peace. It's like he walked in, offered everyone a peace treaty and a friendly smile, and they just said, "Sure, why not?" Beats being constantly threatened by the king. With the conquest of Babylon, Mesopotamia became a satrapy, a province, within the vast Achaemenid Persian Empire, the land between the rivers, which had cradled the very first cities, the first writing, the first laws, and the first empires, was now a vital, but no longer independent, part of a much larger imperial structure. But the legacy of Mesopotamia did not simply vanish. The Persians, though they imposed their own rule, largely respected the local cultures and institutions. Cuneiform continued to be used for administrative purposes alongside Aramaic, which became the lingua franca of the Persian Empire. Babylonian astronomy and mathematics continued to flourish, absorbed and further developed by Persian scholars. The administrative techniques, legal principles, and urban planning innovations developed over millennia in Mesopotamia profoundly influenced the Persian Empire and, through them, later civilizations. Historians still debate whether the Persian conquest was a positive development for Mesopotamia, bringing greater peace and stability under a larger, more tolerant empire, or if it simply marked the loss of its unique independent identity. It's a complex question, like asking if moving from a tiny independent shop to a giant chain store is a good thing for everyone, regardless. As you finally leave this land of rivers and gods, remember that every time you see a written word, every time you think about a legal system, every time you use a 60-second minute, you are touching the enduring legacy of Mesopotamia, from the humble mud-brick houses of Uruk to the grand ziggurats of Urned Babylon, from the meticulous scribes to the ruthless conquerors. The people of this ancient land laid the groundwork for so much of what we consider civilized today. They weren't just building cities, they were building the very idea of civilization itself, brick by painstaking brick, tablet by meticulously inscribed tablet. We've journeyed through nearly 3 millennia of human endeavor, starting with the very first stirrings of civilization in the fertile embrace of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. You watched as the simple need to manage water and resources blossom into the first cities like Uruk, giving birth to specialized labor, complex administration, and the groundbreaking invention of cuneiform writing. We saw the rise of powerful priests who held sway over both spiritual and economic life, and explored the enduring human questions of life and death through the Epic of Gilgamesh. Then came the ambitious age of empires, first with Sargon of Akkad, forging the world's first unified realm, only for it to eventually collapse under environmental and external pressures. The resilient spirit of Mesopotamia saw a resurgence with the meticulous administration of the Ur-III dynasty, followed by the brilliant reign of Hammurabi, whose revolutionary legal code brought order and justice to his Babylonian empire. You experienced the intellectual brilliance of Babylon, its contributions to astronomy and mathematics, before the terrifying might of the Neo-Assyrian war machine dominated the region, building a vast empire through conquest and fear, yet paradoxically, preserving immense knowledge in the library of Ashurbanipal. Finally, you witnessed the dramatic fall of Nineveh, the brief but glorious resurgence of Neo-Babylonian splendor under Nebuchadnezzar II, and the ultimate, peaceful absorption of Mesopotamia into the vast Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Through it all, the legacy endures, the fundamental concepts of urban living, organized governance, written law, scientific inquiry, and the profound human stories that still resonate today. These are the quiet whispers of the past, carried on the gentle breeze from ancient riverbanks, reminding us of where our journey truly began. The rivers flowed, the civilizations rose and fell, but the ideas they birthed continued, slowly, gently, shaping the world we now inhabit.